If you ever hear a room go silent in under 1 second, it usually means someone powerful just decided the rules no longer matter. In downtown Chicago, at exactly 9:47 p.m., that silence fell inside a private lounge owned by the Cole organization. The chandeliers above were warm, gold-toned, expensive in a way that didn't try to impress anyone because it didn't need to. Men in tailored suits stood frozen mid-conversation, glasses half-raised, breath held as if the air itself had become negotiable. At the center of it all stood Vincent Cole. 6'2", composed, still as stone, dressed in a dark suit that blended into the room like a shadow that had learned how to think. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The man in front of him, a mid-level associate who had just made the mistake of lying about missing funds, was already understanding that explanations were now irrelevant. Vincent's eyes didn't blink. That was what people remembered most. Not anger. Not emotion. Just absence of hesitation. One word left his mouth, calm, precise, final, and the room accepted it like a law of nature being enforced. Outside the glass walls, Chicago traffic continued as if nothing had happened, yellow taxis sliding through rain-slick streets, pedestrians waiting at crosswalks, life pretending it was not fragile. Inside, however, everything had already shifted back into order. Vincent turned slightly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, and the tension in the room dissolved into carefully rehearsed normalcy again, as if everyone had collectively agreed not to speak about what had just occurred. That was how it always worked around him. Silence first. Compliance second. Memory last. No one had touched Vincent Cole in years, not physically, not emotionally, not in any way that mattered. People didn't approach him, they calculated him. Even those closest to him understood there were boundaries that weren't drawn in space, but in consequence. He built his world that way after everything he once trusted collapsed without warning, after loyalty turned out to be something people only practiced when it benefited them. Since then, he had become efficient, untouchable, precise. Emotion was a variable he removed from every equation. Across town, in a part of Chicago where the buildings were older and the lights less forgiving, Ava Brooks finished her shift at a small all-night diner. The air smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread, the kind of place that survived not because it thrived, but because people needed it to exist. She tied her jacket tighter against the October wind outside, stepping onto the sidewalk with the quiet fatigue of someone who had learned to keep moving regardless of how heavy the day felt. She wasn't part of Vincent Cole's world. People like her rarely were. She had no idea that, just a few miles away, a man who didn't allow unpredictability had just experienced the smallest fracture in his carefully controlled universe. And she certainly didn't know that, within hours, her name would be the only variable he couldn't ignore. Across Chicago, the night did not feel unusual for most people. Cars moved through intersections, neon signs flickered above late-night stores, and the wind carried the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. But in the upper floors of a secured building downtown, Vincent Cole remained standing in the same position long after the room had emptied. The others had already left with careful nods and measured steps, but he stayed still, as if motion itself required permission. His gaze was fixed on nothing in particular, though anyone observing closely would understand he was calculating something far beyond the room. A tablet lay on the table beside him, its screen dimming from inactivity, displaying reports that meant nothing to anyone without context. He finally exhaled once, slow and controlled, and turned away. Down below, the city looked ordinary again, but Vincent knew better than to trust appearances. At precisely the same time, across town, Ava Brooks was finishing closing duties at the diner where she worked double shifts most days. The last customers had already left, leaving behind empty cups and chairs that had been pushed slightly out of place. She wiped down the counter with slow, practiced movements, her thoughts drifting somewhere between exhaustion and routine concern about rent due at the end of the month. Life did not pause for her, and she had long since stopped expecting it to. When she finally stepped outside, the air was colder than she expected, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The city around her felt large in a way that was not exciting but overwhelming, as if every building carried stories she was not part of. She started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks away, head slightly lowered against the wind, unaware that somewhere above street level, a private vehicle had already begun moving in the same direction she was headed. Inside that vehicle, Vincent Cole was reviewing something different from business reports. It was a simple staff log from one of his properties, nothing unusual at first glance, just names, shifts, and schedules. But one name had appeared twice in places that did not align with expected rotation. Ava Brooks. It was not important enough on its own to matter, not in the way most people would assume a man like him spent his attention. Yet Vincent did not ignore inconsistencies, even small ones. He tapped once on the screen, pausing longer than necessary. The driver noticed nothing. Outside, streetlights passed in steady rhythm, illuminating the interior briefly before fading again into darkness. Ava reached the corner near the bus stop and waited under a flickering light, shifting her weight slightly from one foot to the other. The bus was late, as it often was on this route, and she glanced down at her phone, checking the time before slipping it back into her pocket. She had no awareness that the trajectory of her night had already been altered by something she had never seen. In another part of the city, Vincent closed the file and set the device aside. He did not think of it as curiosity. He did not think of it as interest. It was simply an unresolved variable, and unresolved variables had a way of returning at inconvenient times. When the vehicle slowed near a red light, he finally looked out the window. The city reflected back at him in fragmented motion, glass and light and distance. Somewhere within that movement, without knowing why, he remembered something he had not thought about. In years. Not a person. Not a place. Just a feeling he had once removed from himself deliberately. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not immediately push it away. The red light outside the vehicle shifted to green, and the motion resumed through downtown Chicago as if nothing in the atmosphere had changed. Vincent Cole remained silent in the back seat, but the silence was no longer empty. It had texture now, like something faintly unresolved pressing at the edges of his attention. He did not like that feeling. It was inefficient. Everything in his life had been structured to remove inefficiency long ago. Yet the data on the tablet remained closed, and the name he had seen once refused to disappear from his thoughts. Ava Brooks was still, on paper, irrelevant. A diner employee with no financial ties, no organizational connections, no reason to appear in his world at all. That was what made the inconsistency more noticeable. Vincent looked down again at the file he had reopened without consciously deciding to do so. The system logs showed nothing unusual beyond repetition of her shifts at 2 different locations owned indirectly through subsidiaries. A minor clerical overlap, most would ignore it. He did not. Not because he suspected anything specific, but because patterns that did not belong always carried potential risk. Across the city, Ava stood under the flickering bus stop light, checking the time again. The wind had grown slightly stronger, pulling loose strands of hair across her face. She tucked them back behind her ear and exhaled slowly, watching the empty road stretch ahead. The bus was now nearly 12 minutes late, which meant she would likely have to walk part of the way home if it did not arrive soon. She adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced down the street, unaware that a black vehicle had turned onto the same road 2 blocks away, moving at a controlled and steady pace. Inside that vehicle, Vincent finally closed the file. He leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged, but his focus no longer divided. The decision forming in his mind was not emotional, nor impulsive. It was simply procedural. He would verify the inconsistency himself. Not through intermediaries, not through reports filtered by others. Direct observation eliminated error. That principle had served him for years. The vehicle slowed again, not because of traffic this time, but because the route naturally passed near one of his properties. A small diner, still open, lights glowing warm against the glass. Vincent's eyes shifted briefly toward it without intention. And then, something changed in the rhythm of his attention. Ava was visible through the window. Not clearly at first, just a passing figure moving behind the counter, adjusting chairs, preparing for closing. There was nothing remarkable in her movements. No indication she belonged anywhere outside of what she was doing. Yet Vincent did not look away immediately. That was new. He did not interpret it as significance. He did not assign meaning. But he also did not dismiss it. The vehicle continued forward, passing the diner and merging back into the flow of traffic. Ava eventually left the bus stop when it became clear the bus would not arrive in time, beginning the walk home along the sidewalk under dim streetlights. Her steps were steady, unhurried, accustomed to distance and routine. Above the city, the wind shifted again, and somewhere between movement and stillness, two separate paths in the same environment continued without awareness of proximity. Vincent remained silent for the rest of the drive, though the city no longer felt entirely predictable. He did not name the sensation, because naming something gave it weight, and weight led to unnecessary attention. Instead, he filed it away mentally as unresolved. In another part of Chicago, Ava turned a corner toward her apartment building, never noticing the same black vehicle pause briefly at the intersection she had just crossed, nor the man inside who was no longer looking at data, but at space itself, as if expecting something within it to eventually respond. Vincent Cole arrived at his private residence just after midnight, the city lights fading behind him like distant reflections that no longer demanded attention. The house was modern, minimal, and carefully maintained, designed to remove distraction rather than invite comfort. Inside, everything was silent in the way expensive spaces often are, where sound is absorbed rather than echoed. He removed his suit jacket, placing it with precise alignment over a chair, then loosened his cuffs without rushing. There was no routine deviation in his movements, yet something remained unsettled beneath the structure of his thoughts. He poured a glass of water and stood near the large window overlooking the city skyline. From this height, Chicago looked orderly, almost calm, but Vincent knew better than to trust appearances. Order was always temporary. He glanced once at the tablet on the counter, still powered on. The system had refreshed the employee logs again, and once more the same inconsistency appeared. Ava Brooks. The repetition should have been meaningless. It was not. He set the glass down and finally allowed himself a rare deviation from procedure. Instead of analyzing the data again, he requested location verification through internal tracking systems tied to property access points. The response came back within seconds. Ava Brooks had exited the diner at approximately 10:43 p.m. and was now within walking distance of a residential district 3 blocks from one of his smaller managed properties. Vincent stared at the information without expression. It was not surveillance in the traditional sense. It was infrastructure awareness. Every property, every employee, every system under his control existed within a framework of accountability. Yet even as he rationalized it, the action felt less mechanical than usual. Across the city, Ava reached the entrance of her apartment building and paused briefly to pull her jacket tighter against the wind. The building was older, functional, with flickering exterior lights that never seemed urgent enough to be repaired quickly. She entered the lobby, greeted the night security attendant with a small nod, and moved toward the elevator. Her thoughts were simple, focused on rest, on preparing for another shift tomorrow, on small predictable concerns that filled most of her days. She did not think about patterns or systems or the invisible structures of ownership surrounding her environment. She only noticed that the elevator was slower than usual tonight. Upstairs, Vincent had already moved away from the window. He sat at a table now, the tablet placed in front of him, though he was no longer actively reviewing it. Instead, he had opened a separate internal mapping system, one that displayed real-time movement data across properties he indirectly controlled. It was not personal interest. It was verification protocol. Ava Brooks appeared as a small moving point on the interface, progressing steadily toward a residential endpoint. Vincent observed this without assigning importance, yet he did not close the system either. That small deviation again registered, though he refused to categorize it. A moment later, he shut the system down entirely. Not because the data was irrelevant, but because continued focus would create unnecessary persistence. He stood again, moving toward the kitchen, where the environment remained unchanged, predictable, controlled. However, as he placed the glass in the sink, he paused for less than a second longer than necessary. It was subtle, almost imperceptible even to himself. And yet it happened. Somewhere across the city, Ava stepped out of the elevator on her floor, walking toward her apartment door, completely unaware that her name had just been removed from one system and would soon, without intention or explanation, reappear in another. The night in Chicago had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that made the city feel almost detached from the lives moving through it. Vincent Cole remained in his residence, now seated in a different part of the room, where low lighting softened the sharp edges of the furniture. He had not spoken for nearly 40 minutes. The silence around him was intentional, not empty. On the table beside him, a printed property report lay untouched, though his eyes occasionally shifted toward it without reading. The earlier data stream had already been closed, yet the name Ava Brooks remained present in a way that did not require a screen to persist. He did not acknowledge this directly. Instead, he redirected his attention to a separate internal review of staffing coverage across multiple locations. Everything appeared consistent, stable, and predictable. That was what made the earlier irregularity remain unresolved. Across the city, Ava stood inside her small apartment, leaning briefly against the closed door after entering. She exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the day settle before she moved further inside. The room was modest, with soft lighting and a faint hum from the aging heater near the window. She placed her bag down, removed her jacket, and walked toward the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Her routine was simple, shaped by repetition rather than choice. She glanced at the clock on the wall, noting how late it had become, then opened a small cabinet to retrieve a packet of tea she rarely used but kept for nights when sleep felt delayed. She did not think about the man she had briefly passed during her shift earlier that day, nor did she think about the quiet vehicles she occasionally noticed idling near intersections during her walk home. Those details did not register as meaningful. They were simply part of the background noise of city life. Meanwhile, Vincent had shifted again within his residence. He now stood near a secondary workstation, one used for administrative oversight rather than operational command. The interface displayed aggregated movement data across multiple city zones, filtered through layers of organizational structure that most individuals within his network would never see directly. His gaze moved across it without urgency. Yet despite the lack of urgency, his focus remained unusually anchored. He did not assign emotional interpretation to this. Emotion was not a relevant metric in his system of decision-making. Still, the persistence of a single data point created a subtle deviation in his otherwise structured evaluation process. Ava Brooks had no direct connection to any operational category that required attention. That fact should have concluded the matter. Instead, it did not. He reached for the tablet again, reopening the file without immediate purpose. The information displayed remained unchanged, yet he studied it longer than before. Outside, Chicago continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the quiet intersections forming within its structure. Ava finished preparing her tea, holding the warm cup in both hands as she stood near the window of her apartment. She looked down at the street below, observing passing headlights and distant movement without attaching meaning to them. Her thoughts remained grounded in the immediate, in the ordinary flow of her life. In another part of the city, Vincent finally set the tablet down again, but this time he did not fully disengage from the thought process it had triggered. Instead, he remained standing in place for several seconds longer than necessary, his attention no longer on data, but on something less defined that existed just beneath it. Then, without explanation or external input, he made a decision that was not reflected in any system or protocol. He would observe directly, not through reports, not through summaries, but through presence. And for the first time that night, the distance between two unrelated lives in the same city began to narrow in a way neither of them had yet recognized. Vincent Cole did not inform anyone of his decision. Not his internal staff, not the drivers, not the systems that normally tracked his movements with precision. Instead, he left his residence at a time that did not align with his usual patterns, stepping into the quiet Chicago night without the presence of an escort vehicle waiting at the entrance. The city air was colder at street level, carrying the faint metallic scent of recent rain. He adjusted his coat once, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, and began walking in a direction that was not dictated by obligation or necessity. Across town, Ava Brooks had already finished her tea and moved through the final parts of her nighttime routine. The apartment lights were dim now, the only sound coming from a small heater near the window. She sat briefly on the edge of her bed, scrolling through her phone without focus, then set it aside and leaned back slightly. Her thoughts were simple, centered around the next morning's shift and the quiet repetition of another workday. She did not know that at this exact time, Vincent Cole had entered a vehicle not assigned to his standard fleet. The car was unmarked, ordinary in appearance, blending into traffic without drawing attention. The driver did not ask questions. That was the rule in his organization. Questions were replaced by instructions, and instructions were rarely questioned. Vincent looked out the window as the city passed by in controlled motion. Streetlights reflected briefly against the glass before fading again into darkness. He did not have a destination recorded in any system. Instead, he relied on internal mapping, the same information he had reviewed earlier, narrowing down the location associated with Ava Brooks through indirect property coverage zones. It was not precise in a personal sense, but it was sufficient for observation. The vehicle slowed near a residential district that matched the data range. Vincent did not immediately exit. He remained seated, observing the environment through the window. The area was quieter than the central districts, with older buildings and fewer active storefronts. Light flickered intermittently from street lamps that had not been replaced in recent cycles. People moved through sidewalks at a slower pace here, carrying the weight of routine rather than urgency. He finally stepped out, standing still for a moment as the vehicle moved away without delay. There was no acknowledgement between him and the driver. Vincent began walking, his presence unnoticed by most who passed him. At the same time, Ava had left her apartment again briefly, stepping outside to discard a small bag of trash in the designated area near the building entrance. She paused for a moment after returning outside, glancing down the street without focus. Something about the quiet felt slightly different tonight, though she could not identify why. She dismissed the feeling as fatigue and pulled her jacket closer around her. Vincent stopped at the edge of a crosswalk several blocks away, his attention now aligned with the general direction of the building associated with Ava's residence. He did not accelerate his pace. There was no urgency in his movement. Instead, there was observation, measured and controlled. A passing bus illuminated the street briefly as it moved through the intersection, revealing Ava for a moment in the distance as she re-entered her building lobby. Vincent did not react outwardly. He simply noted the visual confirmation. And yet, internally, the presence of that brief alignment between data and reality registered more distinctly than anything else that evening. The gap between information and observation had closed, and with it, something unclassified began to take shape in his awareness, though he still refused to define it. Across the street, Ava disappeared behind the lobby doors, unaware that her movement had just been observed in real time by someone who had never once needed to search for anything in his life without already knowing where it should be. The city had entered its quietest hour, the time between night and early morning when even movement felt deliberate. Vincent Cole stood across the street from the residential building where Ava Brooks had just disappeared inside. He did not move immediately. Instead, he observed the structure itself, the entrances, the lighting, the timing of foot traffic, as if the building were another system requiring assessment rather than a place where people lived. His presence on the sidewalk remained unnoticed. People passed him without hesitation, their attention directed toward their own destinations. That anonymity was not accidental. It was a result of long-standing discipline in how he carried himself, how he occupied space without demanding recognition from it. After several moments, Vincent finally crossed the street. His steps were steady, unhurried, and aligned with nothing except direction. He entered the building lobby without resistance. The night attendant looked up briefly, registered nothing unusual, and returned to his screen. Vincent continued toward the elevator, pressing the button once. The doors opened almost immediately. Inside the elevator, he did not check his reflection or adjust his posture. There was nothing to correct. Everything about him remained controlled by default. As the elevator ascended, he reviewed the layout of the building internally, based on structural data rather than observation. Floor distribution, unit spacing, emergency exits. All information he had access to through property systems he indirectly controlled. Ava Brooks resided somewhere within this framework, though not in a way that should have required his physical presence. The elevator stopped on a mid-level floor. Vincent stepped out and walked down the hallway, stopping at a section where two units faced each other across a narrow corridor. He paused there without explanation. Behind one of those doors, Ava Brooks had already prepared for sleep. She lay in bed, the room dim, her thoughts slowing as fatigue finally settled in. The events of her day felt distant now, reduced to routine fragments that no longer carried weight. Outside her apartment, the hallway remained quiet. She did not hear footsteps approaching because there were none close enough to register yet. Vincent stood still for a moment longer, not because he was uncertain, but because observation required continuity. He was not here to interrupt anything. He was here to verify something that could not be fully understood through systems alone. He had learned over time that data explains structure, but not presence. Ava turned slightly in bed, adjusting her position. The sound of distant city traffic filtered through the building walls, soft and constant. She exhaled slowly, eyes half closed, unaware of anything outside her immediate space. Vincent remained in the hallway, his attention fixed on the closed door without assigning emotional interpretation to it. There was no intent to disrupt, no defined objective beyond confirmation of proximity. Yet for reasons not yet categorized, he did not leave. The silence between them was absolute, separated only by walls, distance, and lack of awareness. In that moment, two entirely different systems of life existed within the same narrow space. One governed by routine and exhaustion, the other by control and structure. Neither had intersected in any meaningful way, yet the conditions for intersection were now fully present. Vincent finally shifted his stance slightly, as if preparing to move, but did not yet take the step that would define direction. Inside the apartment, Ava closed her eyes completely, drifting closer to sleep without knowing that on the other side of a thin wall and a quiet hallway, something had already begun to observe her existence with a level of attention that had never been applied to her before. Vincent Cole remained standing in the hallway longer than expected, his attention fixed on the closed apartment door as if it were a final point in an equation that still required confirmation. The building was silent now, the kind of silence that did not feel empty but contained, as if every sound had agreed to pause. He did not move forward immediately. Instead, he recalibrated the situation internally, not through emotion, but through structure. The presence of Ava Brooks inside that apartment was no longer theoretical. It was confirmed through proximity, timing, and environmental consistency. Yet even with confirmation, Vincent did not assign purpose to his presence here. He simply remained. Inside the apartment, Ava had already fallen into a light state of sleep. Her breathing was steady, slow, shaped by exhaustion rather than comfort. The city outside her window continued its distant rhythm, headlights passing occasionally through thin curtains, creating brief patterns of light across the wall before fading again. She did not wake. She did not sense anything unusual. The world, for her, remained unchanged. In the hallway, Vincent finally shifted his weight slightly. The decision to stay had not come from instruction or necessity, but from something less defined, something he had not categorized. He looked once more at the door, then at the corridor stretching behind him. Both directions were neutral. Both options were valid. Yet neither resolved what had brought him here. He raised his hand slightly, not to knock, but to confirm distance. Then he stopped. The action did not complete. Instead, he lowered his hand again with controlled precision. There was no external interruption, no sudden realization. Only a quiet internal adjustment that did not translate into immediate movement. For a brief moment, Vincent stood in a state that did not belong in his usual framework. Not indecision, but non-classification. Across the threshold, Ava shifted slightly in her sleep, turning her head toward the window without waking. The faint glow of distant streetlights touched the edge of her room, then faded again. She remained unaware of everything beyond her immediate space. Vincent exhaled once, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Then he took a single step backward, increasing the distance between himself and the door. That step did not represent withdrawal. It represented recalibration. He turned slightly, preparing to leave the hallway, but paused again before fully committing to movement. Something about the moment had not concluded in a way that fit his internal structure of resolution. Still, he did not return to the door. Instead, he began walking toward the elevator at a steady pace, his footsteps controlled and evenly spaced. Behind him, the apartment remained unchanged, the door closed, the occupant unaware of any presence outside her immediate world. As the elevator arrived and its doors opened quietly, Vincent stepped inside without hesitation. The doors closed, and the building returned to silence. Yet the interaction, though never direct, had already shifted something subtle within the framework of observation. Two lives had come within a distance measured not in intention, but in proximity alone, and even without contact, that proximity no longer reset to zero. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical sound, sealing Vincent Cole inside a quiet vertical descent that felt separate from the rest of the city. The display above the doors changed floors in steady increments, each number passing without urgency or resistance. He stood in the center of the space without leaning, hands relaxed at his sides, posture unchanged from how he had always carried himself in controlled environments. Yet something about the night no longer aligned with his usual internal structure. It was not disruption. It was accumulation. Outside, Chicago continued in its predictable rhythm of distant headlights, scattered traffic signals, and buildings that never fully slept. Vincent reached the ground floor and stepped out without hesitation. The lobby attendant glanced up briefly, then returned to a screen, registering nothing of significance. Vincent exited the building and paused once more at the entrance, looking out toward the street he had crossed earlier. The air was colder now, carrying the faint weight of early morning approaching without announcement. He did not immediately move toward his vehicle. Instead, he stood still for several seconds longer than necessary, as if confirming that nothing within him required correction. Across the city, Ava Brooks remained asleep in her apartment. Her breathing was steady, uninterrupted, her body fully surrendered to rest after a long day that meant nothing beyond its repetition. The city outside her window had begun to thin in activity, transitioning slowly toward early morning quiet. She did not know that someone had stood outside her door earlier, nor that the distance between two unrelated paths had narrowed to a point that could no longer be described as coincidence. Vincent finally began walking again, but not with the same internal certainty that had defined every movement of his life until now. There was no objective to complete, no system to verify, no instruction guiding direction. The absence of those structures created a space he did not immediately fill. He reached the vehicle waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door without speaking. Vincent entered and closed it behind him. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the sparse early morning traffic. As the city lights passed across the window in slow repetition, Vincent looked at them without analysis. For years, everything he observed had been categorized, processed, and stored as part of a larger framework of control. But tonight, that framework had encountered something it did not fully define. Not a threat. Not an opportunity. Something that existed without classification. He did not instruct the driver to change route. He did not open any systems. Instead, he remained silent, allowing the vehicle to continue its default path. Behind them, the residential building where Ava Brooks slept receded into distance, indistinguishable from every other structure in the city at that hour. Yet Vincent did not erase it from his awareness. He simply did not assign it priority. And for the first time in a long time, that lack of prioritization did not feel like resolution. It felt like pause. Ava would wake in a few hours and return to her routine without awareness of what had occurred nearby. Vincent would return to his structured world of operations, decisions, and control. Nothing externally visible had changed. But internally, a boundary had formed that did not exist before. Not between people, but between certainty and observation. And as the vehicle continued forward through the quiet streets of Chicago, Vincent Cole remained silent, not because there was nothing to process, but because for the first time, processing was no longer immediate.